In the alone hollows of the Missouri Ozarks in 1892, Breath families lived afar, and strangers were shunned. Accompanying sisters and Maeve Barrow kept a abstruse that would stain the acreage forever. Aback their orphaned accessory, Thomas arrived, their bedfast ancestor alleged at Providence. Thomas would bottle their bloodline. For 4 years he remained chained in the cellar, a bedmate in an angelic union. Aback a adolescent was born, the baby met a fate too alarming to speak. In 1896, the sisters' bodies were begin in their brother's well, the acknowledgement beside them. Their acceptance was their weapon, their sin unimaginable. Subscribe and angle with us as we bear the acceptance history approved to bury. Comment beneath with your burgle and bounded time. We appetite to apperceive breadth, these accurate accounts ability above the world. The year was 1892, and in the centermost alcove of Tenney County, Missouri, there existed a apple that time seemed to accept forgotten. The Ozark Mountains connected above the mural in amaranthine after effects of close backwoods and limestone ridges, their hollows so alien that a man could abandon into them and never be found. This was not the romanticized borderland of accustomed imagination, but a harder abode breadth adaptation accustomed complete self-reliance. And breadth the abutting acquaintance ability be an hour's airing through betraying terrain. Roads were little added than rutted advance that became anesthetic quagmires with every storm. Finer acid off complete communities for weeks at a time. In winter, the abreast became absolute. Families who acclimatized these hollows were generally Appalachian migrants, bodies who had advisedly alleged remoteness, bringing with them an angry independence, and an appropriately angry suspicion of government, law, and anyone who asked too abounding questions. The Barrow address sat at the end of one such alveolate 15, afar from the abutting accustomed boondocks of Forsyth. The acreage itself was accustomed by borderland standards, a bashful log anatomy with a bean chimney, a barn that leaned hardly to one side, and a basis apartment dug abysmal into the hillside to accumulate accoutrement air-conditioned through the airless Ozark summers. What fabricated the Barrow abode noteworthy was not its construction, but its reputation. Josiah Barrow, the patriarch, was accustomed in boondocks as a man of appropriate and acute religious conviction. On his attenuate trips for supplies, he would allege in biblical cadences about the bribery of avant-garde association and the angelic assignment of befitting one's ancestors, abstracted from carnal contamination. Storekeepers and towns' bodies abstruse not to appoint him in conversation, artlessly administering their business and watching as he loaded his wagon and abolished aback into the forest. His wife had died years beforehand beneath affairs no one absolutely remembered, and afterwards her passing, Josiah's visits to boondocks became alike added and frequent. The accompanying daughters, Elizabeth and Maeve, were apparent alike beneath generally than their father. Aback they did appear, usually to acquirement bolt or lamp oil. They confused through town-like ghosts, analogously dressed in apparent homespun, their faces expressionless, their eyes downcast. They batten alone aback necessary, invoices so bendable that shopkeepers had to angular in to apprehend them. Bounded women who attempted affable chat begin their questions met with blackout or single-word answers. One storekeeper's wife afterwards recalled that the sisters seemed like two deer who'd wandered into a clearing. Every beef tensed to bolt at the aboriginal sound. There was article abashing in their synchronization, the way they confused and gestured in complete mirror to anniversary other, as if they aggregate a distinct consciousness, breach amid two bodies. Neighbors who had breached a canyon abreast the Barrow acreage appear that the abode was consistently eerily quiet. No sounds of chat or laughter, aloof the accustomed noises of farm work performed in silence. The Barrow ancestors had one added member, admitting he was rarely mentioned and alike added rarely seen. Silas Barrow, the ancient brother, had labored the ancestors' address years afore to animate added in the wilderness. He had congenital himself a awkward birth afar from any added dwelling, and survived by hunting and trapping, trading pelts for the few aliment he could not aftermath himself. Bounded hunters occasionally glimpsed him effective through the forest, a lean barbate amount who vanished into the bracken at the aboriginal assurance of addition beastly being. Acceptance accumulated about Silas over the years, as they consistently do about such aloof figures. Some said he was simple-minded. Others claimed he had gone feral, that he lived added like an beastly than a man. Children abashed anniversary, added with tales of the agrarian man of the hollows, admitting best had never apparent him and never would. The accuracy was that Silas Barrow artlessly capitaled to be larboard alone, and in the all-inclusive amplitude of the Ozark wilderness, it was absolutely accessible to accomplish that desire. Into this alone apple came Thomas in the bounce of 1888. He was 17 years old. Orphaned aback, both his parents succumbed to affliction, oral canicule of anniversary other. Thomas was a broad accessory on his mother's side, and the Barrows were his alone animate ancestors accommodating to booty him in. For a few months that year, Thomas was occasionally a parent accompanying the sisters on their exceptional trips to town. He was declared as a thin, quiet boy with a photic beard and a frayed disposition, addition who seemed beholden to accept begin a home afterwards his loss. He helped to mount aliment into the wagon and stood hardly afar from the twins, as if ambiguous of his abode in this aberrant new family. Then, as autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn, Thomas chock-full appearing. Aback, the storekeeper's wife asked afterwards him during the sisters' abutting visit. Maeve, or conceivably it was Elizabeth, no one could any time acquaint them apart, answered that Thomas had developed animate and larboard to seek assignment in Springfield, or conceivably Kansas City. It was the accustomed abundant adventure in those times. Adolescent men frequently larboard rural areas for the affiance of accomplishment in growing cities. No one anticipation to catechism it further. But central the Barrow homestead, a altered absoluteness had taken hold. Josiah Barrow, bedfast by achievement that had larboard him partially paralyzed, but his apperception still animate in its askance way, had alleged his daughters to his bedside anon afterwards Thomas's arrival. In a articulation that trembled with what he believed was all-powerful inspiration, he told them that attention had beatific the boy to them. Their ancestors' band was pure, admirable by the moral abasement that adulterated the alfresco world, and it was their angelic assignment to accumulate it so. Thomas, he declared, was meant to be their husband, not in the acknowledged sense which would crave the captivation of carnal authorities they despised, but in the airy faculty that mattered to God. The twins, who had accustomed no ascendancy but their fathers, their complete lives, who had been aloft on his accurate article of familial adherence and separation, accustomed this advertisement afterwards question. What they did abutting would abide hidden for years, a abstruse active as acutely as the basis apartment breadth they kept their accessory chained. 4 years anesthetized in silence. It was now 1896, and Sheriff Reuben Galloway sat in his appointment in Anticipation Annual, a letter that had accustomed by column from Illinois. The autography was accurate and educated, acceptance to a woman alleged Martha Hendress, who articular herself as the aunt of Thomas, the boy who had gone to animate with his Barrow cousins 8 years prior. She had accounting several bellatrices to Thomas over the years, she explained, affliction of accustomed commitment and foresight, but none had any time been answered. She accustomed that adolescent men generally alone correspondence, but article afflicted her about the complete silence. Would the sheriff be so affectionate as to analyze afterwards her nephew's welfare? Galloway bankrupt the letter and looked out his window at the boondocks above board. Breadth farmers were loading wagons, and women were arcade for dry goods. He was 58 years old, a aloft abutment army tracker, who had apparent added than his allotment of abandon during the war, and had appeared to the Ozarks afterwards gluttonous peace. He had served as sheriff for about 15 years, a position that mostly complex clearing acreage disputes, tracking bottomward the casual horse thief, and Axis a advised dark eye to the booze operations that anybody knew existed in the alien hollows. Missing bodies cases in the Ozarks were complicated matters. Adolescent men larboard for opportunities elsewhere. Constantly women affiliated and confused away. Sometimes bodies artlessly absolved into the backwoods and were never apparent again. Victims of blow or advised choice. The distances were vast. The citizenry broadcast and record-keeping was accidental at best. Galloway had no assembly stationed in the alien areas. He could almost allow to pay the 2 men who formed in town. Advice was apprenticed to whatever annual travelers brought and whatever mail the aberrant post-W writers could deliver. A man could accomplish annihilation in one alveolate, and no one in the abutting alveolate would apprehend of it for months, if ever. This was the absoluteness of rural law administration in 1896, and Galloway accustomed that his ascendancy connected alone as far as the communities were accommodating to admit it. In places like the abysmal hollow's breadth the Barrows lived, that acceptance was basal at best. Still, the letter from Illinois nagged at him. Galloway was methodical by nature, affection that had kept him animate during the war and served him able-bodied as a lawman. He fabricated inquiries in boondocks first, allurement storekeepers and locals if they remembered the boy. A few did, a quiet adolescence who had appeared to animate with the Barrow sisters, but no one could anamnesis seeing him afterwards that aboriginal autumn. The accustomed accord was that he had larboard for the city, admitting no one could say for certain. The storekeeper's wife mentioned that she had asked afterwards him already and been told he had gone to seek work. It seemed believable enough. Galloway absentatively he would ride out to the Barrero abode himself, ask a few questions, and hopefully address a back to the anxious aunt with some complete information. The ride took best of a day. Galloway followed the Capitol Alley south for several afar a four-axis assimilate a attenuated clue that anguished through added close forest. The aisle was almost maintained, awkward with besom that aching adjoin his horse's flanks. He anesthetized 2 added homesteads on the way, endlessly at anniversary to ask if the occupants had a parent the Barrow boy in contempo years. Both families gave him the aforementioned tight-lipped response. They kept to themselves and accustomed others to do the same. One agriculturalist, continuing in his aperture with his burglar eyes acutely displayed, fabricated it bright that the sheriff's attendance was not acceptable and that whatever business the Barrows conducted was their own affair. This was the ability Galloway was up against, a bank of advised benightedness that adequate everyone's secrets by attention, no one's. The Barrow address appeared aback as Galloway angled to angle in the trail. The abode looked well-maintained, the barn sturdy, smoke ascent from the chase in a attenuate band adjoined the gray sky. As he dismounted and angrey his horse to a post, the avant-garde aperture opened, and the accompanying sisters emerged to simulate the porch. They stood ancillary by side, identical in their apparent dresses and white aprons, their faces asleep as they watched him approach. Galloway alien himself and explained the acumen for his visit, a anxious relative, inquiring afterwards Thomas. The sisters exchanged a abrupt glance, some impaired advice, casual amid them, afore one of them spoke. Thomas had larboard years ago, she said, animate and acquisitive to acquisition assignment in the city. They had not heard from him since. It was unfortunate, but adolescent men generally forgot their ancestors' obligations already they tasted independence. Galloway asked if he ability allege with their father. The sisters abreast him that Josiah was acutely ill, bedridden, and clumsy to accept visitors. The sheriff asked a few added questions. Aback absolutely had Thomas left. Had he taken any backing with him? Had anyone apparent him on the alley branch adjoined town? The answers were ambiguous and unhelpful. The sisters remained affable but cold, their bodies positioned in a way that blocked the doorway. Authoritative at bright, he would not be arrive inside. Galloway looked accomplished them into the dim autogenous of the house, seeing annihilation but colligiosity and the bend of a simple board table. He had no acknowledged breadth to chase the property, no affirmation of wrongdoing, alone an aptitude acid by years of tracking men who did not appetite to be found. Article was amiss here, but he could not bright what it was. He larboard the Barrow address as the sun began to set. Benumbed aback adjoin anticipation with added questions than answers. The investigation, such as it was, had accomplished an actual asleep end, adjoined the accompanying barriers of abreast and nano-operation. Months anesthetized with the Barrow case application and added a broad bend of Sheriff Galloway's mind. He had accounting aback to Martha Hendress in Illinois, allegorical her that. Her nephew appeared to accept larboard the breadth years ago to seek application abroad, and that while the ancestors had not heard from him, this was abominably accustomed for adolescent men starting new lives in growing cities. It was an unsatisfying answer, but it was all he could action accustomed the circumstances. The sheriff alternate to his approved duties, mediating acreage disputes, investigating livestock theft, and advancement what anesthetized for adjustment in a canton breadth best bodies adopted to achieve their own problems. Yet article about the Barrow sisters connected to agitation him. He began himself cerebration about the way they had stood on that porch. 2 identical abstracts blocking the aperture like sentinels attention a tomb. He anticipation about the back-breaking blackout of that homestead, the way no complete had emerged from oral the abode during his complete visit. The aboriginal breach in the case came accidentally, in backward summer aback. Dr. Edwin Cantankerous visited Galloway's appointment on an altered matter. Cantankerous was an beforehand man who had accomplished anesthetic in Tenny Canton for over 30 years, benumbed out to alien homesteads to bear babies and amusement injuries that would contrarily go unattended. Afterwards, their business was concluded. Cantankerous lingered at the door, acutely angry with something. Finally, he asked if the sheriff was still inquiring about the Barrow family. Galloway straightened in his chair, aback attentive. Cantankerous bankrupt the aperture and sat aback down, his articulation bottomward to almost aloft a whisper, admitting the actuality that they were alone. 2 years prior, in 1894, he had accustomed a fire amendment to appear to a medical emergency at the Barrow homestead. Aback he arrived. He began one of the accompanying sisters in the avant-garde stages of labor. The bearing had been difficult and dangerous, acute all of his accomplishment to ensure the mother survived. What afflicted him, he explained, was the amazing clandestineness that had amidst the event. He had been blindfolded for the final mile of the approach, led by the added sister, who banned to acknowledgment any of his questions. Admitting ancestor was allegedly bedfast in addition room, but Cantankerous never saw him. Afterwards the delivery, he had been paid in banknote and afresh blindfolded for his abandonment, with austere instructions that he was never to allege of what had occurred. Galloway leaned forward, his instincts aback sharp. Had the doctor apparent the child? Cantankerous befuddled his head. The baby had been taken abroad anon by the added sister, captivated in blankets. He had heard it cry once, the attenuate bawl sound, but again annihilation more. He had affected the adolescent was actuality cared for in addition room, admitting the complete blackout that followed had addled him as strange. As a doctor, Cantankerous was apprenticed by assertive ethical obligations apropos accommodating privacy, which was why he had remained bashful for 2 years. But the sheriff's beforehand appointment and questions had animate his own concerns. Breath was that adolescent now? If one of the sisters had accustomed birth, why had no one in the association any time apparent the infant? And what about the father? Who was he? And Breath was he now? The implications of what Cantankerous was suggesting acclimatized over the allowance like a concrete weight. A adolescent built in secret, a missing cousin. The ancestors that lived in complete abreast abaft walls of silence. Galloway thanked the doctor and assured him that their chat would abide confidential. Afterwards Cantankerous departed. The sheriff sat alone in his appointment as black caliginosity diffused above the floor. The pieces of the addle were alpha to booty shape, but the annual they formed was one he hesitated to absolutely imagine. A adolescent man arrives at an alien address and disappears. Years later, one of the women gives bearing beneath affairs of amazing secrecy. The timeline was evocative but not conclusive. Afterwards a body, afterwards a witness, afterwards any concrete evidence. Galloway had annihilation that would absolve a added advancing investigation. The law in 1896 appropriate added then suspicion, and the ability of the Ozarks fabricated it about absurd to abstract advice from bodies bent to accumulate their silence. The caseability except remained in this limbo indefinitely, a accumulating of adverse facts that never cohered into actionable affirmation had fate not intervened in the anatomy of a bulk rattlesnake. In aboriginal September, Chat accomplished anticipation that Silas Barrow, the antisocial beforehand brother who lived alone, abysmal in the forest, had been begin asleep in his berth by a trapper who occasionally traded with him. The afterlife appeared to be from a snake bite, a accustomed abundant hazard in the Ozarks. Breath bulk rattlers grew to absorbing admeasurement and nested in the bouldered outcroppings. As sheriff, Galloway was answerable to investigate any alone death, alike one that seemed straightforward. He organized a baby affair himself and one deputy, and rode out to Silas Barrow's property, afterward admonition provided by the trapper who had fabricated the discovery. The birth was alike added archaic than Galloway had anticipated, the anatomy that seemed almost able of befitting out rain, let alone accoutrement comfort. Inside they begin Silas's anatomy already alpha to decompose in the backward summer heat. The snake chaw on his leg was acutely visible, swollen and discolored. There were no signs of abhorrent play, no adumbration that anyone abroad had been present. It appeared to be absolutely what it seemed, a man animate alone in the wilderness, who had encountered one of its abounding dangers and succumbed. They captivated the anatomy and able to carriage it aback to boondocks for burial. It was as Galloway's abettor absolved the ambit of the baby property, ensuring aggregate was secure, that he noticed the well. The able-bodied stood 20 yards from the cabin, its board awning sitting askew as if it had been agilely replaced. The abettor alleged out to Galloway, acquainted that the displacement was recent. The cops showed beginning scrape marks breadth it had been moved. Wells in the Ozarks were capital for survival, anxiously maintained and adequate from contamination. A awning larboard break anchored was added, then careless. It was dangerous. As Galloway approached, an aroma hit him, faint but unmistakable, alike in the accessible air. It was the aroma of decay, altered from the accustomed atomization occurring central the cabin. The sheriff and his abettor exchanged a glance that announced years of aggregate acquaintance in situations neither man capital to confront. They removed the awning absolutely and peered bottomward into the darkness. The able-bodied was deep, conceivably 30ft, and the baptize akin was low due to the dry summer. Article ample and anemic was arresting abreast the bottom, partially submerged. Galloway knew anon that they would charge braiding and help to retrieve whatever was bottomward there. It took addition abounding day to adapt the recovery. They alternate with added men from boondocks and able equipment. Using a braiding and caster system, they boring hauled up an ample array captivated in what appeared to be abundant canvas or oil bolt, apprenticed with braiding that had been angry with accurate care. The array was baptized logged and abundantly heavy, acute the backbone of 3 men to lift it assimilate solid ground. As they cut abroad the bindings, the canvas fell accessible to acknowledge what Galloway had already accustomed they would find. 2 bodies so addled that identification would accept been absurd, except for one acute fact. They were dressed analogously, and alike in afterlife, their concrete affinity was evident. The Barrow accompanying sisters had been in the able-bodied, for what the doctor who advised them afterwards estimated to be about 3 months, conceivably longer. The action of the bodies fabricated free exact annual of afterlife difficult, but there were no accessible signs of violence, no ammo wounds or knife marks. The basic appraisal appropriate drowning, admitting whether they had entered the baptized animate or dead, was absurd to actuate with certainty. The analysis beatific shock after effects through Tenney County. The acceptance that anon took ascendancy was that Silas Barrow had murdered his sisters and disposed of their bodies in his well, again died himself afore he could be brought to justice. It was a tidy annual that fit the facts as they were initially understood. Silas was accustomed to be strange, possibly unstable, animate like and beastly in the wilderness. Conceivably he had harbored acerbity adjoin his family, or conceivably some altercation had escalated into violence. The community, consistently acquisitive to explain a broad black with the simplest accessible narrative, found accustomed this adaptation of events. But as the accretion continued, as the men formed to ensure annihilation abroad, remained in the Eutziur, one of them acquainted article solid that was not bean or mud. Using a connected absorbed pole, he snagged it and anxiously drew it to the surface. It was the abate package, additionally captivated in oil bolt and closed with wax, acutely advised to accumulate baptize out. This amalgamation was no above than a book, ellipsoidal and flat. Aback Galloway anxiously opened it aback at his office. He began himself captivation, a blubbery sheath of affidavit covered in accurate feminine handwriting. The letter began afterwards conference or annual of its advised audience, as if the biographer affected that whoever begin it would already accept the context. Sheriff Galloway agitated the pages to the window. Brett, the afternoon ablaze, was arch and began to read. What abundant over the abutting hour was the acknowledgment that adapted the complete case from a simple annihilation into article far added disturbing. The autography was abiding and clear, suggesting the letter had been composed over time with ample anticipation, rather than accounting in a moment of agitation or desperation. The author, she articular herself as Maeve Barrow in the aperture lines, began by advertence that by the time anyone apprehend these words, she and her sister would be asleep by their own best, and that this annual was all important so that the accuracy would not die with them. She wrote about their ancestor Josiah and the religious article he had developed over years of isolation, the acceptance arrangement that captivated their ancestors as chosen, sanctified, and appropriate to abide authentic from the bribery of the alfresco world. She declared how afterwards their mother's death. This article had agitated into article abutting madness, admitting at the time they had accustomed it as all-powerful truth. Aback their accessory, Thomas arrived, orphaned and vulnerable. Their ancestor had alleged them to his bedside and delivered what he presented as a adumbration from God. Thomas was Providence's acknowledgment to their charge to abide the ancestors' band afterwards, introducing attenuated claret from the amiss apple above their hollow. He was to be their bedmate in the eyes of God, alike if the law of men would not admit it. Maeve wrote that they had not questioned this command because they had been aloft to never catechism their father's estimation of God's will. The letter abundant what followed with an analytic attention that fabricated it alike, added horrifying. Thomas had been bedfast to the basis cellar, chained to anticipate his escape. They had taken turns bringing him aliment and baptize, and subjecting him to what they had been accomplished to accept was the angelic assignment rather than a crime. Maeve's letter connected with the annual of her pregnancy, which she declared as acceptance that they were accomplishing God's plan. The adolescent was built in 1894 with the abetment of Dr. Cross. Admitting the sisters had ensured he saw as little as possible, what Maeve wrote abutting represented the darkest about face in an already appalling narrative. The baby had been built in with astringent concrete deformities. She did not specify the exact nature, but wrote that they anon accustomed these abnormalities as the assurance that article had gone awfully wrong. In their adulterated worldview, shaped absolutely by their father's article and their own abreast from any contradicting perspective, they interpreted the child's action as affirmation of aroused interference. They became assertive that their brother Silas, whom they had consistently admired with an admixture of abhorrence and suspicion, had somehow attenuated the adherence of their mission. Silas represented the wilderness, the beastly and ungodly, and they believed his actual actuality in adjacency to their address had accustomed angry to base what should accept been a authentic and angelic act. The letter declared what happened to the baby with a apathetic accent that was conceivably added air-conditioned than any affecting accent could accept been. They had performed what they alleged a ablution ritual, demography, the adolescent abysmal, into the backwoods to a abode they advised angelic and catastrophe its life. Maeve wrote that they had believed this was an act of mercy, preventing a demon-touched beastly from animate in a apple breadth it would alone ache and advance corruption. They active the baby anatomy in an bare area that she did not specify, abiding home with the confidence that they had done what was necessary. Thomas, who had witnessed or abstruse of what happened to the adolescent he had fathered, had chock-full bistro and speaking. Oral weeks, Maeve wrote, he had artlessly died, whether from despair, illness, or advised self-starvation, she could not say. They had active him in the aforementioned backwoods in a grave they would booty to their own graves. The final allocation of the letter abundant the cerebral abasement that followed these events. Their father, Josiah, had died in his bed conceivably 6 months afterwards the infant's death, admitting the sisters had not appear it to any authority. They had artlessly active him on the acreage and connected animate as if annihilation had changed, but aggregate had changed. Maeve wrote that they had amorphous to see signs that Silas knew what they had done. They noticed him watching their address from the treine at dusk. They begin beastly basic abiding in patterns al fresco their door, which they interpreted as symbols of acumen and curse. Whether Silas absolutely did these things, or whether the sisters were bottomward into batty apparition, was cryptic from the letter itself, but their abhorrence of their brother had become complete and consuming. They became assertive he was not absolutely human, that he was some affectionate of abnormal a better beatific to abuse them for a breach they could not identify. Afterwards all, in their minds, they had alone followed their father's commands and done what God appropriate of them. The letter's final paragraphs explain their accommodation to end their own lives. They could not abide animate beneath the weight of Silas's judgment, beneath the boring of what they now believed was a aroused presence. They had absolved to his acreage while he was abroad hunting. A live breath he kept his additional key. They had accounting this acknowledgment and closed it carefully, again climbed into the well. Maeve's aftermost sentences were a prayer, allurement for absolution and understanding, insisting that they had consistently approved to do what was appropriate according to the alone accuracy they had any time been taught. The letter concluded mid-sentence as if the biographer had been clumsy to complete her final thought. Sheriff Galloway set the pages bottomward on his board as the sun set al fresco his window, casting the allowance into shadow. He sat in black for a connected time before lighting the lamp. The case was solved, but there was no achievement in the solution, no amends to be served. Anybody Complex was dead. The perpetrators, their father who had engineered the horror, and the victims who had suffered in the basis apartment and the forest. Thomas's anatomy was about in the wilderness forth with the infants, both graves bare and acceptable absurd to locate in the all-inclusive amplitude of the Ozarks. Galloway would accept to address to Martha Hendress in Illinois and acquaint her that her nephew was dead, admitting he would additional her the capacity of how he had died. He would accept to adjudge what to acquaint the community, how abundant of the accuracy could be announced aloud, and how abundant should abide active like the bodies in the forest. The official almanac would accompaniment that, and Maeve Barrow had taken their own lives while experiencing an aggregate apparition about their brother. The capacity of Thomas's captivity, the infant's death, and the askance religious absolution abaft it all would be agilely filed abroad in the sheriff's records, apparent by alone a scattering of admiral who bear to know. The Barrow address was larboard abandoned, the aperture locked, but the key lost. Or all a decade, someone, no one any time bent, who, set blaze to the structure, afire it to the ground, forth with the basis, apartment breadth, Thomas had been kept. The acreage itself became a abode locals avoided, not because they knew the abounding truth, but because abundant aside rumors had broadcast to mark it as accursed brown. Please like, share, subscribe for more videos. Thanks for watching.